Tonight we begin with an intelligence operation that had Western analysts, stunned Russian commanders scrambling, and Kremlin officials issuing denials before anyone had even made an accusation. An operation that unfolded not over months of careful planning, visible to satellites but in total silence, executed across dozens of locations simultaneously. An operation that left 9,000 Russian soldiers incapacitated. 9,000 soldiers who never saw the enemy. 9,000 soldiers who discovered that the war had come to them, not through artillery, not through drones, not through the front lines they had been trained to defend, but through something far more insidious. What Ukrainian intelligence services allegedly pulled off in the last 72 hours crosses a line that military strategists have discussed in theory but rarely witnessed in practice. And when Moscow finally understood what had happened, they did not respond with missiles. They responded with panic. They responded with denial. And most tellingly, they responded with silence. Because what happened this week may represent the single most effective asymmetric operation of the entire war, and Russia has no idea how to admit it. For months now, there had been signals, not official government communications, not military broadcasts, just signals that Ukraine's security service, the SBU, is preparing something unconventional. Ukraine has been innovative, yes, but they have been predictable in their innovation. Drone strikes on oil refineries, attacks on the Kerch Bridge, naval drone operations in the Black Sea. Their moves have followed a certain logic, a pattern, almost a rhythm, but what set off alarm bells in Western intelligence agencies this month was that the pattern went silent. Analysts who monitor SBU operations know the indicators, the intercepted communications, the movement of known operatives, the financial transfers through monitored channels, the sudden increase in encrypted traffic. All of that went quiet 3 weeks ago. The SBU's operational signature essentially vanished from the intelligence landscape. And whenever Ukrainian intelligence goes quiet, it means something significant is being protected, something they don't want anyone, including their allies, to see coming. What we now know is that during those 3 weeks of silence, Ukraine was coordinating what may be the largest poisoning operation against military personnel since the Second World War. Early Tuesday morning, multiple sources within the Russian military medical corps began reporting an unusual surge in hospitalizations. Soldiers presenting with severe gastrointestinal symptoms, soldiers experiencing neurological impairment, soldiers collapsing during routine operations, not from exhaustion, not from combat stress, but from something they had consumed. The initial reports suggested food poisoning, an unfortunate but common occurrence in military camps where hygiene standards vary. But within 12 hours, the pattern became impossible to ignore. These weren't isolated incidents. They were simultaneous across Belgorod, across Kursk, across occupied Donetsk, across logistics hubs in Rostov and Don. These are the kinds of synchronized effects that don't happen by accident. These are the kinds of results that require planning, access, and execution at a level that most intelligence agencies only dream of achieving. Russian military officials didn't know whether this was sabotage, terrorism, or an act of war that existed in a category they hadn't yet defined. But what they did know was that their supply chain had been compromised. And when a military supply chain is compromised at this scale, without detection, it means something terrifying. The enemy is already inside. The alert, issued within Russian military command structures Thursday night, was not routine. It was not a standard health advisory. It was not a recommendation. It was a full supply chain lockdown. Source after source within military logistics networks described the situation, using words rarely seen in official communications: contamination, infiltration, and perhaps most significantly, undetectable origin. Russian commanders were suddenly faced with a nightmare scenario. They could not identify which supplies were safe. They could not identify which personnel had been compromised. They could not identify whether the operation was ongoing or already complete because the poisoning didn't kill. That's the part that military analysts find most sophisticated. The agents used, still unconfirmed, but believed to be a combination of chemical compounds that induce severe but non-lethal symptoms, were designed to incapacitate. Not eliminate a dead soldier is a tragedy. Now 6 soldiers is a logistics catastrophe. 9,000 soldiers who cannot fight, who require medical evacuation, who consume resources, who create panic among their units. That is asymmetric warfare at its most effective. Ukraine, if these reports are accurate, didn't aim to kill Russians. They aimed to break Russia's ability to function. Tonight, intelligence sources have confirmed that Ukrainian operatives allegedly infiltrated at least 3 major supply distribution centers. Serving Russian forces, the targets were not ammunition depots. They were not command centers. They were not fuel reserves. They were food and water supplies, specifically bottled water shipments destined for forward operating bases, packaged military rations distributed across the Kursk defensive line, and most disturbingly, medical supplies that soldiers trusted implicitly. Ukrainian operatives contaminated these supplies before they entered the Russian military distribution network. By the time the supplies reached soldiers, they had passed through multiple checkpoints, multiple inspections, multiple hands, all of which unknowingly distributed the contaminated materials. Further, this is what made Russia's response so chaotic. The contamination wasn't introduced at the point of consumption. It was introduced at the point of origin, which means Russia now has to question not just what their soldiers ate this week, but what they've been eating for the past month. They hit the water, they hit the food, they hit the medical supplies that soldiers use when they're already vulnerable. In other words, Ukraine targeted the one thing every soldier trusts without question: the supplies that keep them alive, the logistical backbone that makes military operations possible. This is what made the operation so devastating. Russia's soldiers didn't fail. Russia's security didn't fail. Russia's trust failed, and once trust fails at that level, it cannot be easily restored. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Analysts now believe that Ukraine's operation was designed to exploit a very specific vulnerability. Russia eased reliance on contracted supply chains since the war began. Russia has increasingly outsourced military logistics to private contractors, civilian companies, and in some cases, networks with questionable oversight. This created efficiency, but it also created access points. Ukrainian intelligence didn't need to infiltrate the Russian military. Directly, they needed to infiltrate the civilian networks that feed the Russian military. And those networks stretched thin, underpaid and operating under enormous pressure, were far easier to penetrate. Sources speaking with Western media under anonymity described Ukraine's approach as supply chain warfare, a method designed to exploit the weakest links in an adversary's support structure. But Ukraine proved this week that they understand something Russia underestimated. Modern militaries don't fail on the battlefield. They fail in the logistics centers. They fail in the supply depots. They fail when soldiers stop trusting the water they drink. Russia has spent 2 years building defensive lines. Ukraine just proved those lines are meaningless. If the soldiers manning them can't function, the operation was not only effective, it was calibrated so precisely that the symptoms appeared simultaneously across multiple regions, ensuring maximum confusion and preventing any single incident from being isolated and contained. That level of coordination suggests months of planning, extensive human intelligence networks, and a level of operational security that rivals any Western intelligence service. As reports continued coming in throughout the weekend, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's alleged operation. Military hospitals in Rostov and Don reported a 300% increase in emergency admissions, forcing the diversion of medical personnel from combat support roles. Logistics units in Belgorod halted all food distribution for 48 hours, while emergency testing was conducted, leaving frontline units dependent on emergency reserves that may also be compromised. Commanders in occupied Donetsk quartered soldiers to consume only locally sourced food and water, creating immediate shortages and forcing requisitions from civilian populations already struggling with scarcity. This wasn't just an attack on soldiers. This wasn't just an attack on supplies. This was an attack on Russia's ability to sustain operations. This was an attack on institutional trust. And institutional trust is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain. Since the war began, for every defensive position they have fortified, Ukraine has found an asymmetric counter that renders those fortifications less effective. For every soldier Russia deploys, Ukraine has found ways to ensure that soldier cannot perform at full capacity. This is the new face of warfare. Not battles, not territory systems, trust function. Remember, Russia thought their supply lines were secure. They thought their logistics networks were too distributed to target. Effectively, they thought Ukraine lacked the intelligence, penetration to execute an operation at this scale. They thought the war would be won through attrition, through grinding territorial gains, through sheer mass of personnel and equipment. But tonight the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is proving that mass can be neutralized through precision. Ukraine is proving that defensive lines mean nothing if the defenders are incapacitated. Ukraine is proving that the most powerful weapon in modern warfare is anti-missile or a drone. It is access, and Ukraine, despite being outgunned and outmanned, has access that Russia cannot secure against.